The city seemed like a faded photograph that October day. The sky was the color of wet asphalt, and the rain fine and persistent, as if sifted through a sieve coated every surface with a dull, oily sheen. Leo walked the streets without purpose, hands shoved into the pockets of his thin coat that no longer shielded him from the damp chill. He loved weather like this. It was honest. It didn't promise sun or warmth. It simply was itself grey, pensive, and endless. It was a convenient cloak for his own melancholy, which had become his constant companion in recent weeks, a quiet, silent neighbour sitting across from him at the kitchen table. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just letting his feet carry him through the maze of alleys, past shop windows reflecting his own tired face and the pale sky. His thoughts flowed slowly like tar. He thought about work, the project that had hit a dead end, about the silence that had settled into the apartment he shared with Annie. It wasn't hostile silence. No, it was cautious, fragile, like thin ice on a puddle you're afraid to break with a careless step. Annie had become different, quiet, distant. When he asked what was wrong, she just shook her head and offered a weak smile that made his insides clench. The smile of someone bearing their burden alone and not wanting to burden anyone else. He stopped in front of a small cafe with fogged-up windows, warm, honeyed light spilling out. The Viennese roll. He remembered how Annie loved this place. She said it smelled like childhood and cinnamon, and that even the gloomiest day brightened at the sight of their cream pastries. The desire to get warm, drink something hot, and escape the dampness for even half an hour overpowered his apathy. He pushed open the heavy oak door, and the aromas of coffee, vanilla, and fresh pastries washed over him. Inside it was cozy and nearly empty. A few tables were occupied by couples and solitary patrons with books. He chose a spot in the corner by the window to watch the rain and passers-by. The waitress, a young girl with freckles, brought him a menu. He ordered black coffee without looking. He wanted nothing but bitterness and warmth. It was at that moment, as he looked up from a sticky spot on the tabletop, that he saw her. Annie. She was sitting at a table at the far end of the room, her back to him. He would have recognized that back, that line of her shoulders, that chestnut knot of hair at her nape out of 1,000. His heart did an awkward flip and stopped. Joy, surprise. He almost stood up, approached her, hugged her, asked what she was doing here alone. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man. Leo didn't know him. Tall, with a confident posture, wearing an expensive cashmere sweater. He couldn't see his face clearly, just his profile sharp, strong-willed. They were talking quietly about something. Annie leaned forward, and her face held an expression Leo hadn't seen in a very long time. Alive, animated, tense. She wasn't smiling, but her whole being radiated attention, expectation. The man was saying something, and Annie listened, her fingers gripping her cup tightly. Leo sat frozen, turned to stone. The air in his lungs solidified, sharp and prickly. He watched them like a scene from a silent movie. Then the man reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Annie didn't pull her hand away. She just slowly lowered her eyes, and in that simple gesture was so much intimacy, so much hidden meaning, that Leo saw spots before his eyes. Everything fell into place. Her silence, her distance, her nighttime sighs when she thought he was asleep. He didn't feel anger. Anger would have been too simple, too pure an emotion. What he felt was more like slow poisoning, a cold, viscous venom spreading through his veins, freezing his blood. Every year they'd shared, every laugh, every shared secret, every cup of morning coffee drunk in their tiny kitchen, all of it turned to lies in an instant. A stage set for a play where he, it turned out, had played the blind fool. He watched them, and scenes from their life flashed through his mind. There they were, very young, running through a summer downpour, her head thrown back in laughter. There she was, asleep on his shoulder in a night bus, returning from her sick mother's. There they were, wallpapering their first rented apartment, smeared with paste, and happy. And there she was now, just yards away, her hand in another man's, and the Annie from the past and this Annie in the present refused to merge in his mind. They were two different people from parallel worlds. The waitress brought his coffee. He stared at the black steaming liquid and saw nothing. A buzzing filled his ears. He had to do something, stand up, go over, make a scene, smash dishes, shout. But he couldn't move. His body felt alien, disobedient. The only thing moving were his thoughts, darting like crazed birds in a cage. He signaled to the waitress. "Excuse me, do you have a pen?" "And something to write on?" She looked at him, surprised, but nodded and returned a minute later with a ballpoint pen and a paper napkin. His hand shook as he formed the letters. He didn't think about the words. They landed on the thin paper by themselves, crooked, angry, final. "Tell her not to come home." He reread it. A cold, merciless phrase, a sentence passed without trial or investigation. He didn't add his name or signature. She would understand. He folded the napkin in half, placed several large bills on top for the coffee and the service. "When I leave," he said to the waitress quietly, almost a whisper, his own voice sounding foreign, "please give this to the woman at that table." "In the grey coat." The girl looked at him, bewildered, then at Annie, then back at him. Sympathy or curiosity flickered in her eyes, he couldn't tell. She just nodded. Leo stood up. His legs felt like cotton. Without looking back, he walked towards the exit. Each step was an effort, as if he were wading through deep mud that sucked him down deeper. He pushed the door open and plunged back into the cold drizzle of the October evening. He didn't go home. Home didn't exist anymore. It wasn't a home, just an apartment, 4 walls filled with things that had lost all meaning. He wandered towards the river. The rain intensified, streaming down his face, mingling with something hot and salty leaking from his eyes. He wasn't crying. No, it was just rain, outside and in. He reached the embankment and stopped, staring at the dark leaden water. Streetlights reflected in trembling yellow paths. A steamboat hooted somewhere in the distance. The sound was so full of hopelessness that Leo shuddered. He pictured the waitress approaching their table, placing the folded napkin in front of Annie, looking at her in surprise, then unfolding it. He tried to imagine her face at that moment. He couldn't. Instead, his memory supplied another image. A summer evening 2 years ago. They sat on this very embankment, eating ice cream. Annie laughed and said, "You know, sometimes I'm afraid this is all a dream, that I'll wake up and you won't be there, that it's all too good to be true." He had hugged her then and replied, "It's not a dream. I'm not going anywhere." He stood in the rain, alone on the empty embankment, realizing she had been right. It had been a dream. And now he was awake in a cold, grey world where her hand was in another man's, and he himself had just destroyed everything they had with one stroke of a pen on a cheap napkin, or everything he thought they had. He didn't know how long he stood there. An hour. 2. The cold seeped into his bones. He thought about what she was doing now. Had she read the note? What did she feel? Anger? Relief? Maybe she just shrugged and continued her conversation with that other man, already forgetting him? That thought was the most terrifying. He needed to go somewhere, but all roads led to the past. He slowly trudged along the river, moving farther from the center, from their neighborhood, from their life. His mind held no clear thoughts, only a dull, aching pain, like a splinter he couldn't remove, and one question hammered at his temples like a trapped bird. Why? But there was no answer. Only dark water, cold rain, and the endless empty night ahead. A night in which, for the first time in many years, he would be truly alone. He didn't know then that this night was only the beginning, the start of a long journey into darkness, where he would have to grope for the wreckage of his life and himself, not understanding that the main deceiver in this story wasn't Annie, but his own pain, which had blinded him and made him believe the simplest, cruelest version of the truth. The night wasn't just the absence of day. It turned out to be its own, living substance, thick and heavy like river water in November. It enveloped Leo, filled his lungs, seeped under his skin. He wandered through the deserted streets of the industrial outskirts where his feet had taken him, and each step echoed dully in his hollowed-out soul. Street lights were sparse here. Their dim yellow light snatched fragments of reality from the darkness, a peeling brick wall, rusty gates, the skeleton of a lone tree, only to release them back into the gloom. It was a world without nuance, a world where everything seemed final. He had long stopped feeling the cold. His body seemed resigned to its fate as a thoroughly soaked object and no longer sent distress signals. Only inside did that slow, icy heartburn continue to burn. He replayed the cafe scene in his head over and over. Every movement, every glance, the gesture of the man covering her hand, the way she didn't pull away. That image was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. It became more real than all the memories of their life together. His memory, cruelly, supplied precisely those memories. The warmest, most vulnerable moments. There they were, 3 years ago, in a little house by the sea they'd rented with their last money. Morning. A sunbeam pierced a crack in the shutters, drawing a golden stripe on her cheek. She was asleep, eyelashes fluttering slightly, and he lay beside her, afraid to move for fear of shattering that moment of absolute, almost painful happiness. He'd thought then that he would give anything for that moment to last forever. And now, had it been real? Or had he just been sleeping next to a very talented actress? He stopped in front of the window of a long-closed shop. In the grimy glass, a vague, stooped figure was reflected. He didn't recognize himself immediately. The man in the window looked older, more crushed. Leo pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Why hadn't she said anything? Why hadn't she confided in him? Even if she'd fallen in love with someone else, didn't he deserve at least a word of truth? Didn't everything they'd shared warrant that? He would have understood. Probably he would have let her go. But this quiet, careful lie, this web she'd spun around him for weeks, months, that was unbearable. He didn't just feel deceived. He felt erased, cancelled, as if he hadn't truly existed in her life. The moment the heavy oak door of the Viennese roll closed behind him, the world at the table in the far corner froze for an instant. Annie flinched at the sharp sound and the draught that swept past her legs. "Something wrong?" asked the man sitting opposite her. His voice was low and slightly hoarse. "No, nothing." Annie shook her head, trying to return to the conversation. "Just thought Kyle, I'm not sure this is a good idea." "It's too risky." Kyle, her older brother, whom she hadn't seen for almost 5 years, wearily rubbed the bridge of his nose. Years spent God knows where and how had left their mark on his face. He looked older than his 35 years. Sharp wrinkles creased the corners of his eyes, and his dark hair was shot through with grey. But his eyes were the same Annie's, dark brown, only now they held a deep-seated anxiety. "Annie, there's no other way," he said quietly but insistently. "I've lost everything. These people. They won't back off. I need to leave, start fresh. I need your help. I have no one else to ask but Leo. I can't just take that money from him. It's our joint savings. We were saving it for a down payment. He needs to know what it's for." "And what will you tell him?" Kyle gave a bitter laugh. "That your no-good brother is in trouble again? That he messed with the wrong people and needs to disappear fast? He'll never understand. He's the straight arrow, right? Decent. He'll think I'm using you." Annie was silent. Kyle was right. Leo was a straight arrow. Honest. He couldn't tolerate lies or half-truths. He wouldn't understand how she could hide something like this. He would insist on going to the police, doing everything by the book. He wouldn't understand her desperate, irrational desire to simply save her brother, pull him out of the hole he'd dug for himself. That's why she had been silent these past weeks, meeting Kyle secretly, trying to find a way out, torn between her love for her husband and her duty to her brother. It was at that moment the young waitress approached their table. "Excuse me," she said to Annie, looking at her shyly. "The gentleman who just left." He asked me to give you this." She placed a paper napkin, folded in half, on the table. Annie looked at her surprised. "What gentleman?" "Well, he was sitting over there, in the corner." The girl gestured vaguely. Annie took the napkin. Her fingers suddenly felt clumsy. An icy premonition gripped her from within. She unfolded it. A few uneven, hastily scrawled words. Tell her not to come home. She read them once, twice, 3 times. The letters danced before her eyes, but the meaning didn't change. He had been here. Leo had been here. He had seen everything. But what had he seen? He had seen her. He had seen Kyle. He had seen her brother take her hand, trying to calm her when she was on the verge of tears. And he had understood it his own way. The air vanished. She opened her mouth like a fish thrown ashore, but couldn't draw breath. The world narrowed to those 4 terrible words on the napkin. "Annie, what is it?" Kyle leaned towards her, trying to see. She silently handed him the napkin. He scanned it, and his face turned to stone. That was him. "Your husband? He was here?" Annie could only nod, unable to utter a word. She jumped up, knocking over her chair with a crash, grabbed her purse, fumbled with trembling hands for her phone, dialed Leo's number. Long, hopeless rings, again and again. "I need to go," she whispered, looking at her brother with frantic eyes. "I need to find him. He got it all wrong, Kyle. He got it all wrong." She ran out of the cafe without her coat, straight into the damp chill of the October evening. The rain instantly soaked her hair and thin blouse. She ran down the street, not seeing where she was going, scanning the faces of passers-by, peering into dark silhouettes. But he was nowhere. He had vanished, dissolved into that grey, weeping city, leaving behind only that monstrous note and the ruins of their world, which had collapsed on her head in an instant. Leo found a room for the night in a small, nameless hotel near the train station. An old building sinking into the ground, a creaking staircase smelling of dust and something sour. The room was a tiny space with a narrow bed, a sagging armchair, and a window facing the blank wall of the neighboring building. A perfect place to disappear. He locked the door and leaned his back against it, the silence pressed on his ears. He didn't undress, just lay down on the bed atop a worn bedspread and stared at the ceiling with a cobweb in the corner. He thought he would feel rage, a desire for revenge, but none of that came. There was only all-consuming bottomless exhaustion, as if some vital core holding him together had been removed, and now he was just crumbling into pieces. He took his phone from his pocket. Several missed calls from Annie. He looked at her name on the screen, and it seemed foreign. The name of a woman he, it turned out, didn't know at all. He turned off the phone and tossed it aside. He didn't want to talk. Didn't want to hear justifications, lies, explanations. Everything had already been said by her gesture in that damned cafe. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her face appeared before him again and again, that animated, alive face as it was there, opposite the other man, and the frightened, guilty face he imagined her wearing when she read his note. Which one was real? He no longer knew. In the darkness of the hotel room, under the drumming of rain on the windowsill, Leo felt utterly, truly alone for the first time in his life. Not the pleasant solitude of being by oneself, but a total cosmic loneliness of a man who had lost not just love, but his point of reference, the center of his universe. He didn't yet know that Annie was frantically searching the nighttime city for him. He didn't know that the truth had been very close, but a wall of pain, pride, and monstrous misunderstanding had grown between them, a wall that night seemed impossible to break down. The rain outside the window didn't stop. It became the background, the soundtrack to the disintegration happening inside Leo. In the tiny room of the nameless hotel, time seemed to stop. It thickened like cooling wax, and Leo was embedded in it, motionless like an insect in amber. He lay on the bed, still in his damp coat, staring at the dirty ceiling. The cobweb in the corner, barely visible in the gloom, seemed like a map of his own life, tangled, meaningless, and abandoned by its inhabitant. He tried to force himself to think of something else, work, the half-built ship models on his desk, the book he hadn't finished. but his brain refused to obey. It was a broken projector replaying the same short film over and over. Annie, her head tilted, her hand in another man's hand. He didn't just see betrayal, he saw the end of trust. And what is love without trust? Just habit, a set of rituals, two strangers living together. The thought that he had merely been a convenient screen behind which she lived her real life was physically painful. It brought waves of nausea. All their conversations, all their plans, all their we. It all seemed like a farce now. He remembered how just a month ago they sat in the kitchen drinking tea, and he told her about his dream to someday buy a little house by a lake. Not now, later when they were more settled. He described the house, a big porch for summer evenings, a fireplace for winter warmth, and she listened with such a tender smile, chin propped on her hand, saying, yes, that would be wonderful. Had she known then? Had she already been seeing him? Was she listening to him while thinking of someone else? That thought was like a red-hot needle piercing his heart. He turned onto his side, facing the wall with peeling paint. He hated her. At that moment he hated her more fiercely than he had ever hated anyone. And that hatred made him feel worse because beneath it, like black water under ice, love still lived, crippled, poisoned, but not dead. And this split tore him apart. Annie ran until her lungs burned. She stopped in the middle of an empty, rain-swept square, breathing heavily, realizing she didn't know where to run next. The city, which had always been home, familiar and understandable, suddenly felt hostile and alien. It had hidden Leo, taken him from her. She dialed his number again and again. The phone was off. The mechanical voice of the auto-reply sounded like a sentence. He wasn't just not answering. He had cut himself off from her. Deliberately. Cruelly. She drifted towards their house. Her legs carried her there out of habit, though her mind screamed he wouldn't be there. Approaching the building, she saw their third-floor windows were dark. That darkness was deafening. Usually, if Leo was home, he always left a small nightlight burning in the hall. He said it made the house look alive, like it was waiting for you. Now the house wasn't waiting, it was dead. Climbing the stairs, she froze before the door. The key in her hand felt like a foreign object. She forced herself to insert it into the lock and turn it. The silence inside the apartment was almost tangible. It was thick, heavy, filled with absence. Annie walked in without turning on the light. She stood in the dark hallway, and the scent of their life hit her. The familiar smell of books, wood, and the faint trace of his cologne lingering in the air. And the sheer familiarity of that scent made the pain so unbearable she doubled over, clamping a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She walked into the living room. Everything was in its place, his unfinished book on the armchair, his cup on the kitchen table, his slippers by the bed. The world had frozen the moment he left. Every object screamed of him, of his presence that was now an absence. She sat on the edge of their bed and only then realized she was soaked to the skin. The cold pierced her to the bone, but she didn't notice it. She looked at his pillow, at the indentation still holding the shape of his head, and the tears she had held back for so long streamed from her eyes. She wasn't crying over the cruelty of his note. She was crying from horror, from understanding the pain she had caused him without intending to. She saw the situation through his eyes. He had come to their favorite cafe and seen his wife with another man. He had seen their secret meeting, their intimate conversation, a gesture that could only be interpreted one way. He didn't know that man was her brother. He didn't know the desperate situation they were in. He saw betrayal, and he had reacted sharply, finally, like a man dealt a mortal wound. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She flinched, hoping for a miracle. But the screen said Kyle. Annie, did you find him? Her brother's voice was full of anxiety and guilt. No, she whispered. His phone's off. He's gone. Annie, I'm sorry. This is all my fault. I should never have dragged you into this. Stop, she interrupted him. Her voice was hoarse from crying. That doesn't matter now. What matters is what he thinks. He thinks I betrayed him. But you can explain everything to him? How? She almost shouted into the phone. How do I explain if he won't even hear me? If he erased me from his life with one phrase on a napkin? A heavy silence hung on the other end of the line. I should leave, Kyle finally said. Tonight. There's a train in 3 hours. I can't put you in more danger. No, Annie said firmly. She was surprised by the steel in her own voice. You're not going anywhere. Not now. You stay here. You're the only one who can back me up. You have to talk to him. Annie, he won't want to talk to me. He'll kill me. Then we'll find him together, she said, standing up. Despair was replaced by a strange, cold resolve. I won't let this misunderstanding destroy my life. I won't let his pain become the truth. I'll find him, and you're going to help me. In the hotel room, Leo finally slept. It wasn't sleep, but a heavy, sticky stupor full of anxious, fragmented images. He dreamed he was walking down an endless corridor with identical doors. He knew Annie was behind one of them, but he didn't know which one. He opened one door, emptiness behind it. Another, the man from the cafe sat there laughing in his face. A third, and there he was, a little boy crying in the corner. He woke up from his own scream, drenched in cold sweat. It was getting light outside. A grey, joyless dawn seeped lazily into the room. The rain had stopped, but the sky was covered in a dense blanket of clouds. Leo sat up on the bed. His head buzzed. The feeling of emptiness hadn't gone, but something else was mixed in now. Doubt, tiny like a grain of sand in the eye, but persistent. He had been sure of what he saw, but was it all so clear-cut? He remembered her face. Yes, it was animated. But was there happiness in it? Or was it anxiety? He remembered how her fingers had gripped her cup. Was that the gesture of someone anticipating something good? Or someone under extreme strain? He pushed the thoughts away. It was his pain trying to find a loophole, a way to deceive itself to lessen the hurt. He wouldn't allow it. The truth was she had deceived him. Weeks of silence and distance, that was the proof. She had been hiding something important, and that something important had been sitting with her in the cafe. He got up and went to the window. His gaze met the blank brick wall opposite. A wall just like that stood between him and Annie now, a wall he himself had built with his note. Was it pride or cowardice? Fear of hearing a truth that might be even worse than his suspicions? He didn't know. He knew only one thing. He wasn't going home. Not now. Maybe never. He had to disappear, let the wound scab over, turn into a scar. He turned on his phone, dozens of missed calls from Annie and a few messages. He didn't read them, he just deleted them without opening them. Then he dialed his boss's number. Sam? Hi, it's Leo. Yeah, sorry it's so early. I won't be able to come in. No, I'm not sick. Family emergency. Very serious. I need to be away for a while. Yeah, I know. The project. I'll hand everything over to the team. How long? I don't know. I'll call. He hung up. Every step he took turning off the phone, calling the boss, deciding not to return, distanced him from his old life, burned bridges behind him. And with each burned bridge he didn't feel lighter, only more terrified. He was like a man pushing his own boat away from shore and heading out into the open, stormy sea without oars or sail. He got dressed, if you could call it that, just straightened his rumpled clothes from yesterday. Left the room, paid the sleepy woman at the front desk who barely looked at him, and stepped outside. The city was waking up. The first commuters hurried past, trams rattled by. Life went on as if nothing had happened, and against the backdrop of the world's indifference, his own grief felt even more deafening. He didn't know where to go. For the first time in his life, he had no goal, no direction. He just walked wherever his feet took him, dissolving into the morning crowd. He didn't know yet that Annie and her brother had already begun their search. They were calling hospitals and the morgue, and soon they would start checking hotels one by one, showing his picture to sleepy desk clerks. He didn't know the truth was desperately trying to catch up with him, but he was running from it so fast it might not make it. Morning for Leo wasn't a beginning, but a continuation of the endless night. He dissolved into the grey mass of people rushing about their business, feeling like a ghost. Every person in that stream had a purpose, a route, a destination work, home, a meeting. He had nothing. Yesterday's world, where he had a home, a woman he loved, and a future, had collapsed. Now he was just a body wandering the streets of a city that had suddenly become foreign. He ducked into the first cheap cafe he saw, not because he was hungry, but because he couldn't bear being outside among the meaningless bustle. He ordered black coffee and sat staring out the window at the passing cars. The coffee was bitter and tasteless, but its bitterness was something real, physical, and it offered a slight distraction from the internal pain that was all-consuming and abstract. He thought about what he would do next. His thoughts were sluggish and disobedient. Leave? Where? He knew no one in other cities. Stay here? But how? Every corner, every street was linked to Annie. He couldn't just erase her like an unwanted file. She was woven into the very fabric of his existence. He remembered her laugh, quiet, a little shy, the one he loved so much. He remembered how she wrinkled her nose when she was displeased. He remembered the mole on her shoulder that he kissed every morning. These memories were torture. They were like shards of a broken mirror, digging into him no matter what he did. He took out his wallet. Among old receipts and business cards he found a small photograph. Him and Annie, 2 years ago, at a friend's wedding. They were laughing, arms around each other, looking ridiculously happy and confident about their future. He looked at the photo, at the smiling girl beside him, and couldn't believe it was the same person who sat in the cafe yesterday with another man. Something didn't add up. Some piece of this puzzle was wrong. But which one? His pride, his pain screamed that it was all obvious, that he shouldn't give in to doubt. But somewhere deep inside, a small, quiet voice whispered that he had made a mistake, that he had judged and sentenced without hearing her out. Annie and Kyle began a methodical check of hotels near the train station. It was Annie's idea. She clung to it like a drowning person to a straw. She reasoned logically. If Leo had decided to disappear, he wouldn't go to friends, wouldn't burden anyone. He'd find a place to lay low. A cheap hotel fit perfectly. At each hotel they were met with indifferent or suspicious looks. Sleepy desk clerks lazily shook their heads, glancing at the picture of Leo on Annie's phone. Haven't seen him, didn't stay here, can't give out that information. Kyle grew gloomier with each refusal. He felt guilty, the cause of this whole nightmare. "Annie, maybe that's enough," he said after the 5th or 6th failed attempt. "It's pointless. We won't find him this way. Maybe he left town." "No," she replied stubbornly, though her own confidence was fading by the minute. "I feel he's here, in the city. He couldn't just leave. He must have. I don't know. But he's here." Her desperation was almost palpable. She seemed to have aged overnight, dark circles under her eyes. She kept fidgeting with her phone, checking if Leo had turned his on. But the phone remained silent. "Come on," she said, pointing to another nondescript sign. "This is the last one on this street." It was the very hotel Leo had checked out of just an hour before. The same sleepy woman sat behind the counter. She gave them a weary glance. "We're looking for someone." Annie began her practice phrase, showing the picture. "He might have stayed here last night." The woman glanced briefly at the screen. "Yeah, he was here," she said indifferently, yawning. "Checked out an hour ago." Annie's heart skipped a beat. "Checked out? Where? Did he say where he was going?" "Lady, am I information?" the woman snapped. "Paid and left. Hardly had any luggage. Looked frankly not so good, like he hadn't slept all night." They stepped back outside. Annie felt both relief and deeper despair. He was alive. He was here so close. But they were too late. By just an hour. "What now?" Kyle asked. Annie leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Where could he have gone? Where does a man go when he no longer has a home? She tried to think like him. Leo loved water. The river always calmed him. In moments of fatigue or deep thought, he often went to the embankment. "The embankment," she whispered. "We need to go to the embankment." Leo didn't notice his feet carrying him to the river. He went down to the water's edge and sat on a cold granite step. Grey, sluggish water flowed past. It was indifferent to everything, to his pain, to his loneliness. And in that indifference there was something soothing. He wasn't the center of the universe. He was just a speck, a little man with his little tragedy. He thought about how his note hadn't just been the gesture of a hurt man. It had been a cry of pain and despair. He had wanted to hurt her as badly as he had been hurt. But now, in the cold morning light, the act seemed petty and cruel to him. He hadn't given her a chance. He had passed judgment based on a single scene, ripped from its context. What if the context had been different? This thought, which he had tried so hard to push away, kept returning. He thought of Kyle. No, not like that. He thought of the man in the cafe. He hadn't seen his face. He had only seen the expensive sweater, the confident posture. He himself had filled in the image in his imagination, a successful, smug rival. But what if he wasn't like that? What if everything was completely different from what he had imagined? He raised his head and saw two figures walking along the embankment towards him, a man and a woman. As they drew closer, his heart stopped. It was Annie. And beside her walked the very man from the cafe. For a moment a wave of anger and pain washed over him again. There it was. They were already together. They weren't even hiding. He jumped up, ready to unleash all his fury, all his grief on them. Annie saw him and froze. Her face was drawn, pale, but a desperate hope flickered in her eyes. "Leo!" she cried, and rushed towards him. He instinctively recoiled. "Don't come near me!" His voice cracked. "I don't want to hear anything. I saw everything. You saw nothing!" She shouted back, stopping a few steps away. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You only saw what you wanted to see. You know nothing. I know you lied to me," he yelled back. A few passers-by turned to look. "You kept silent for weeks, hiding something, and here it is, your secret. Yes, I hid it." Her voice trembled. "I hid it because I was afraid you wouldn't understand, afraid you'd do exactly what you did, judge without understanding." The man who had been standing silently all this time stepped forward. "Leo, right?" His voice was calm and weary. "My name's Kyle. I'm Annie's brother." Leo stared at him. Brother. He tried to find familiar features in his face, something shared with Annie. And now, looking at him without the veil of anger, he saw them. The same eyes, the same shape of the lips. "Brother," he whispered, feeling the ground give way beneath him. "Annie doesn't have a brother, I mean. She said you hadn't been in touch for years, and we weren't," Kyle said. "Because I was an idiot and made a lot of stupid mistakes. I came because I needed help. I got into some very bad trouble, and Annie was the only one who could help me. We met secretly because I asked her not to tell you. I knew you, being a stand-up guy, would insist on going to the police, and I couldn't risk that. I just needed to disappear. The money you were saving, she wanted to borrow it for me." Leo listened to him, and the world crumbled around him for the second time in 24 hours. But this time, it was the wall of his pain, his pride, his monstrous blind certainty in his own righteousness that was collapsing. He looked at Annie. She stood hugging herself, looking at him with pleading and pain. "The note," he whispered. "God, Annie. The note." "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you felt. I saw it through your eyes. And I don't deserve forgiveness for putting you through that. I should have told you everything. I was a coward." He looked at her, his Annie, exhausted, tear-streaked, and felt the ice in his chest begin to crack. All his rage, all his hatred evaporated, leaving only shame behind, overwhelming, all-consuming shame for his cruelty, for his blindness. He took a step towards her, then another. He approached and simply hugged her, tightly, desperately, as if afraid she would dissolve into air. She clutched his coat and sobbed against his chest quietly, soundlessly, her whole body shaking with the horror she'd endured. They stood like that on the embankment, two people who had almost lost each other in one night due to lies, fear, and distrust. Kyle stepped aside, giving them space. He looked at the grey water, feeling out of place, the guilty party in a drama that had nearly ended in tragedy. "Forgive me," Leo whispered into her hair. "Forgive me if you can. I was such an idiot, such a blind, self-absorbed idiot." "And you forgive me," she answered, not raising her head. "I shouldn't have stayed silent. Trust. It's the most important thing. I almost destroyed everything." They stood silently for a long time, and the silence was healing. It was filled not with things unsaid and secrets, but with understanding and forgiveness. The cold October day continued. The city lived its life. But for the two of them, something new had begun in that moment. Not a return to the past, no. That was impossible now. It was the start of a difficult journey back to each other, a journey where they would have to relearn how to trust, to talk, and to listen. A journey at the end of which perhaps waited that very house by the lake, no longer a naive dream, but a hard-earned harbor, built on the ruins of their most terrible night. The embrace on the cold embankment wasn't a solution to all their problems. It was merely a truce, a moment of silence after a deafening explosion. When Leo finally loosened his hold, he looked at Annie as if seeing her for the first time. He saw not just his wife, but a separate person with her own history, her own pain, and her own fears, of which he, in his blissful ignorance, had been completely unaware. He looked at her pale, exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes, her trembling lips, and overwhelming shame washed over him. He wasn't the victim in this story. He was one of its authors, the one who had written the cruelest chapter. Annie pulled back slightly, but didn't let go of his hand. Her fingers were icy, but her grip was strong, desperate. She held on to him as the only solid reality in a world that had just stopped collapsing. She looked at him, and in her gaze he saw not only love and forgiveness, but the shadow of the horror she'd experienced. She had looked into the abyss, and that experience would stay with her forever. Kyle, who had been standing tactfully aside, approached them. His face was impassive, but guilt was frozen in his eyes. He was the catalyst, the grain of sand that started the avalanche. "I should probably go," he said quietly, looking not at them, but off towards the grey river water. "I've caused you enough trouble already." "No," Annie said firmly, not turning her head. Her voice was still weak, but held a steely note. "You're not going anywhere. We're going home. All of us." The word home sounded strange. For Leo, home had ceased to exist last night. For Annie, it had become dead and cold. Now they had to return to that place, filled with the ghosts of the last 24 hours, and try to make it alive again. The walk to their building was silent. They walked as three, but with distance between them. Leo and Annie held hands, while Kyle walked slightly behind like a shadow, not daring to breach their fragile, newly restored space. The city went about its normal life. Cars sped by, pedestrians hurried on errands, seagulls cried. But for the three of them, this world was just scenery. Real life was happening inside them in the heavy silence, in the accidental glances, in the barely perceptible gestures. Leo looked at Annie's profile and tried to understand what he felt. The pain was gone, leaving a hollow echo. In its place, slowly, very slowly, something else was seeping in, tenderness mixed with bitterness. He loved her, that was beyond doubt. But now he understood his love had been selfish and naive. He had loved an image he had created himself, the image of a happy, serene woman existing only within the context of their shared life. He had never considered that she had her own past, her own skeletons, her own obligations that had nothing to do with him. He had demanded absolute transparency from her, denying her the right to secrets, to fear, to weakness. His note hadn't just been an act of jealousy. It had been a sentence against her imperfection, her humanity. Annie felt the warmth of his palm and was afraid to believe the nightmare was over. She replayed his face at the moment of understanding over and over in her mind. That mixture of shock, shame, and pain. She felt sorry for him, and sorry for herself. She understood that her silence, dictated by fear and a desire to protect him, had been a mistake. It had been a form of distrust. She hadn't believed in his ability to understand, to forgive. to accept. She had treated him like a child needing protection from a harsh truth, and in doing so had provoked the catastrophe. She was guilty too, and that realization was heavy but necessary. They opened the apartment door together. The same silence, the same stale air filled with the smell of absence, but this time they entered it not alone, but as three, and that changed everything. Annie, without taking off her coat, walked into the kitchen and turned on the kettle. That simple domestic gesture was like a signal to start a new life. Leo and Kyle followed. Awkwardness hung in the air. "Sit down," Annie said, and they both, like schoolboys, obediently sat at the kitchen table. This was their table, the place for morning coffee, evening talks, arguments, and reconciliations. Now it had to become a place for confession. They sat in silence until the kettle boiled. Annie poured hot water into 3 mugs. Her hands trembled slightly. "Kyle," she said, sitting down opposite him and Leo, "tell him everything, from the beginning. He needs to know now." Kyle raised his eyes. He looked at his sister, then at Leo. His gaze held no bravado, no fear now, only immense weariness. And he began to tell. His story was both banal and terrifying. Several years ago, after another fight with their father, he had gone to another city to prove to everyone and himself that he was worth something. He invested all his savings and borrowed a large sum from serious people to start a small construction business. At first, things went okay, but then his partner screwed him over, and the business went bust. The debt remained, with interest that grew daily. The people he'd borrowed from weren't bankers. They didn't sue. They had other methods. First came threatening calls. Then they found him and beat him up. He knew it was just the beginning. He ran away, came here, to his hometown, like a complete fool, hoping to hide. But they found him here too. They gave him a deadline 1 week to get the money. Or else. He didn't finish, but the implication was clear. "I didn't want to drag Annie into it," he finished, staring into his untouched mug. "I just came to say goodbye, but she saw what shape I was in and dragged it out of me. She offered help. I shouldn't have accepted, but I was desperate. I'm sorry, both of you." Leo listened to him, feeling no judgment, no anger. He saw before him not a criminal or a no-good relative. He saw simply a frightened, cornered man. He looked at Kyle, but saw Annie, her anxiety, her sleepless nights, her distance. Everything fell into place. It hadn't been a lie. It had been an attempt to save. Clumsy, wrong, but driven by love and compassion. "How much?" Leo asked. His voice sounded hoarse and strange. Kyle named the sum. It was almost all their savings, everything they'd put aside for years for a down payment on a mortgage, for that house by the lake. Leo looked at Annie. She looked back at him, holding her breath. There was no plea in her eyes, only expectation. She was leaving the decision to him, and everything depended on that decision, not only her brother's fate, but their own future. He could have said no. He had every right. It was his money, too, his dreams. He could have said Kyle's problems were his own, that they should go to the police, do things the right way. But he remembered his note on the napkin, his cruelty, his blindness, and he understood he had no right to rightness. He had only one way to atone, to show her he understood, that he trusted her, unconditionally. "We'll give you the money," Leo said, looking not at Kyle, but at Annie. "It's your money too. And your family is my family." Tears glistened in Annie's eyes, but they weren't tears of grief or terror. They were tears of relief. She silently mouthed thank you and covered his hand with hers. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. They withdrew the money from their joint account that same day, handed it to Kyle in a plain envelope, without lectures or advice. He took it, his hands trembling. "I'll pay it all back," he mumbled. "I swear I will, once I get back on my feet." "Don't," Leo said. "Just be careful. And call your sister." Kyle left on the evening train, bound for nowhere. They didn't see him off at the station. They stayed home, just the two of them. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the apartment became deafening. The immediate crisis had passed. The problem was resolved, but the tension didn't lift. They were left alone with the consequences, with the emptiness in their bank account and in their souls. They sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. Twilight thickened outside, casting long, strange shadows on the walls. "The lake house won't happen for a long time now," Annie said quietly, breaking the silence. There was no regret in her voice, just a statement of fact. "We'll build it ourselves," Leo replied just as quietly. "Someday. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we have each other. I almost lost you yesterday. Because of my pride, my stupidity. That was the worst thing that's ever happened to me." He stood up, walked over to her, and knelt before her chair. He took her hands in his and pressed his cheek against them. "Forgive me, Annie. Not for the note. For not believing in you. In us. And you forgive me," she whispered, stroking his hair, "for not believing in you." That night, they slept in the same bed but didn't touch. The shadow of the past day still lay between them. They were like two people who had survived a shipwreck, exhausted, frozen, but alive. And grateful for it. Leo woke up first in the morning. He got up quietly so as not to wake Annie and went to the kitchen. He brewed coffee exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. But today this simple ritual was filled with new meaning. He brought a cup to her in bed. She opened her eyes and smiled, weakly but genuinely, for the first time in a long while. "Thank you," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed. Morning light flooded the room, making it clean and new. In this light, they both looked vulnerable and older. They were no longer the naive lovers from the photograph in his wallet. They were people who had been through hell and come out different, a little broken, but wiser. They had learned something very important about each other and themselves, that love isn't just happiness and laughter. It's also fear, pain, and forgiveness. That trust isn't a given, but daily work. And that sometimes to build something real, you have to let everything else fall down first.